facing life and death in the cockpit of a B-24 bomber, high over Nazi Germany, with flak bursting black against the sky, and the lives of 10 young men riding on every decision he made. And then, only a few short years on either side of that, standing under the lights of a Hollywood stage, holding an Academy Award at the very top of the golden age of film. It sounds like two different men, two different lifetimes. But they belong to the same quiet, soft-spoken fellow from a small hardware town in Pennsylvania. His name was James Maitland Stewart. The whole world came to know him simply as Jimmy. Today we go beyond the silver screen. We go past the famous stammer and the aw-shucks smile that an entire country fell in love with. We tell the story of a man who did not just play heroes for the camera. He lived like one, out in the cold, at 20,000 feet, when no camera was rolling and no audience was watching. He had every reason in the world to stay home. He had fame. He had money. He had a contract that made him one of the most valuable men in the picture business. He had powerful people telling him he was a fool to risk a scratch of it. And every single time the easy road and the hard road lay in front of him, Jimmy Stewart chose the hard one, quietly, without a speech, without asking for a bit of credit. This is the story of how a shy boy who built model airplanes in his father's basement grew up to become a real general, and never once let either uniform, the soldiers or the stars, change the plain decent man underneath. Here is the story. It all began in Indiana, Pennsylvania on the 20th of May, 1908. Not the big city Indiana of the movies, a small town in the hills, where everyone knew your name and your father's name before that. His father, Alexander, ran the family hardware store, J.M. Stewart and Company. It had stood on that corner for generations, and it smelled of sawdust and machine oil and cut iron and honest work. A boy growing up in that store learned something money can't teach. He learned that a man's word was his bond, that you fixed what was broken, that you paid what you owed. Alexander Stewart was a deeply religious man, a Presbyterian, and Jimmy sat in that church pew nearly every Sunday of his boyhood, and, truth be told, for most of the rest of his life. His mother was a pianist, and so the Stewart home was a home filled with music. There is a story from those years that tells you everything about that family. A customer came into the hardware store one day and could not pay his bill. Hard times. Instead of turning the man away, Alexander Stewart accepted what the fellow had to offer in trade, an old, beaten-up accordion. And young Jimmy, with a little help from the local barber, taught himself to play the thing. That accordion would follow him all the way to Broadway and to Hollywood. He kept it close his entire life. He was a shy boy. While the other children were out playing ball in the street, Jimmy was down in the basement of the house, bent over a workbench, building model airplanes by hand, delicate, intricate little things, and poring over mechanical drawings and chemistry sets. Every bit of it pointed in one direction, the sky. This was the age of Charles Lindbergh, of men crossing whole oceans alone in fragile machines. And a quiet boy in a Pennsylvania basement dreamed more than anything of one day learning to fly. He was not the brightest student in the schoolroom. His grades ran middling to low, but his teachers all said the same thing. It was never a question of brains. The boy simply lived half in this world and half in his own imagination, somewhere up above the clouds. His father, a Princeton man himself, had a plan for his only son. So Jimmy was sent off to Mercersburg Academy to prepare, and then on to Princeton University, where he studied architecture. He was good at it. Good enough that when he graduated in 1932, he won a scholarship to go further still. But somewhere along the way, the stage had gotten a hold of him. At Princeton, he found the theater clubs, the music, the Triangle Club, and he found something he was better at than drawing buildings. He even served of all things as the head cheerleader. He liked to tell the story years later, laughing at himself. The year he led the cheers. Yale beat Princeton 52-0, the worst beating in the history of the rivalry. And the school newspaper printed an editorial laying part of the blame squarely on him when he turned down that architecture scholarship to join a summer acting company. His family reached for their chairs. His uncle came by before he left for New York and said there had never been anybody connected to the theater in the whole Stewart family, except one fellow who ran off and joined the circus and had been in jail a few times. That was Jimmy's send-off, And then came the Great Depression, in the deepest, hardest year of it. Jimmy Stewart arrived in New York City with almost nothing in his pockets. He shared a cheap rooming house uptown with a handful of other young, hungry, unknown actors. Among them, a lanky young man named Henry Fonda, who would be his closest friend for the next 50 years. The rent was unbelievably low. Only much later did the boys find out why. The place had been a front for a notorious gangster. They had no money. Fonda could just about boil rice, and that was supper. And on at least one famous night, the two of them walked through a deserted Times Square in the small hours, and Jimmy took out his accordion on a dare and began to play. In a few minutes, a crowd had gathered. People started calling out requests. Henry Fonda passed his hat through the crowd and collected the grand sum of 28 cents, before the police came and gently sent them home to bed. That is who he was before he was anybody. Penniless, playing for coins in the street, learning what it really means to be hungry. Those were the years that built the man. Have you ever been that broke, young, far from home, not a dollar to your name? Tell me where you're watching from in the comments. I'd like to know how far this story travels. His Broadway debut did not exactly go to plan. In one early play, he was badly miscast as an Austrian count, and on opening night, a stagehand could not get a door to open on cue, then yanked so hard he pulled down a whole wall of the set, with the pictures crashing off it. Somehow the audience loved it. That was Broadway in the depths of the Depression, where a top ticket cost $3.10, and a young man could find his feet. Then came Hollywood, and then came Frank Capra. In Capra's films, Jimmy Stewart became something America did not even know it had been waiting for, the voice of the ordinary man. In Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, he played a green young senator who walks into a city full of corruption and refuses to bend, talking himself hoarse on the Senate floor for what is right. It was not just a movie. It was a kind of national promise put on film, and it made Jimmy Stewart a star. The very next year, in 1940, he won the Academy Award for Best Actor for The Philadelphia Story. At 32 years old, James Stewart of Indiana, Pennsylvania, stood at the absolute summit of his profession. He had the gold statue. He had the studio. He had the world by the tail, and he could not have cared less about any of it once he saw what was coming, because across the ocean, the world was on fire. And Jimmy Stewart, the boy who had dreamed of flying since he was small, already held a private pilot's license and hundreds of hours in the air. He was not going to sit in a make-believe cockpit on a soundstage while real men climbed into real ones. The studio executives were horrified. He was on paper one of the most bankable stars in the entire industry, and stars did not go to war. One executive is said to have shouted at him that he was at the very peak of his career, that he could not just throw it all away. Jimmy Stewart did not argue. He did not give a speech. He just walked out the door and went down to enlist. He understood something those men in the front office never would. There are things worth more than a career. And then the army turned him down. It is almost impossible to believe now, but in 1941, Jimmy Stewart was rejected. He was too thin. He failed to make the minimum weight for his height by a few pounds. A movie star with an Oscar on the shelf could have taken that as a gracious way out, gone home, and let no one think the less of him. He did the opposite. He went and ate and trained and worked and put on every ounce he could until he weighed enough. And then he talked his way past the scale and got himself sworn in. He did not want the easy out. He wanted in. What he refused, just as fiercely, was the soft-duty Hollywood and the brass both expected of him, making training films and selling war bonds. Safe and stateside, his famous face doing its bit far from any danger. Jimmy Stewart would have none of it. He pushed and pushed to be sent where the fighting was, until they finally let him fly. He rose to command. He became a squadron commander of the 703rd Bomb Squadron, and he flew his men in B-24 Liberators on bombing runs deep over occupied Europe and Germany itself, roughly 20 combat missions, through anti-aircraft fire and enemy fighters, the kind of missions that killed young airmen by the thousands. He did not lead from behind a desk. He flew at the front of the formation, in the most dangerous seat, where a commander belonged. The men who served under him said he was steady and quiet, and that he carried the weight of every life in his squadron like it was his own family. By the end of it, he had been promoted to colonel and decorated for his service. But here is the part that truly tells you who he was. Long after that war was over, when most men his age had hung up the uniform for good, Jimmy Stewart stayed in the Air Force Reserve and kept rising, all the way to Brigadier General. And in the 1960s, during Vietnam, a 58-year-old general named James Stewart insisted on flying along on a combat mission. He did not have to. No one would have asked it of him. He did it for one reason. He said he could not, in good conscience, ask young men to go and do a thing that he was not willing to do himself. Stop and think on that. A movie star, an Oscar winner, a grandfather near 60, a general, climbing into a bomber over a war zone because that was the only way he knew how to lead. They don't make that kind of decency by accident. It is built, one honest choice at a time. When the war finally ended, the hardest performance of his life was still waiting for him. The performance of coming home. Like so many who came back, Jimmy Stewart was not the same man who had left. He had seen too much. He came home quieter and unsure whether the public would even want him anymore. And the first film he made was a small picture that flopped when it opened, and only years later became the most beloved movie in American life. It's a Wonderful Life. He played George Bailey, an ordinary small-town man so beaten down by his troubles that on Christmas Eve, he stands on a bridge, ready to throw his life away, until he is shown what the world would have been without him. It is not hard to see why that role meant everything to Jimmy Stewart in 1946. A man home from a war, wondering if his life still mattered, telling a whole grieving nation the one thing they most needed to hear, that every single life matters. That no honest man is ever truly worth nothing. But there was another side to Jimmy Stewart, and as he got older, he was not afraid to show it. The wholesome boy next door had a darker, more haunted, more obsessive man living inside him, and the great director Alfred Hitchcock saw it and pulled it right out into the open. In Rear Window, and especially in Vertigo, Stewart played men twisted by obsession, by guilt, by fear, men who were not entirely good. And in the westerns he made with Anthony Mann, Winchester 73, The Naked Spur, he played hard, bitter, driven men a long way from Mr. Smith. He was telling us something true. The good man and the troubled man are very often the same man. He did not just put on a character like a coat. He bled his own experience, his own war, his own private darkness into every one of them. That is why, all these years later, the performances are still alive. He meant every frame of them. Have you ever come home from something, changed, quieter, carrying a weight you couldn't quite set down? If you have, you already understand George Bailey better than any critic ever will. For all his fame, in matters of the heart, Jimmy Stewart was in no hurry at all. He stayed a bachelor well into his 40s, so long that the newspapers gave him a nickname, the Great American Bachelor. And then, in 1949, when he was 41 years old, he married a woman named Gloria, and everything in his world finally settled into place. He used to tell the story with that slow grin of his. He married Gloria, who already had 2 young boys from before. And a couple of years in, he found himself the father of 4, because Gloria gave him twin daughters. He would joke that her 2 boys had both wanted sisters, so he just pulled the bowstring back and let it fly. But underneath the jokes was a man who knew exactly what he had been given. He said it plainly, late in life. Gloria made the family for him. She made a home for him to come back to from all those sets and all those years. She taught him, he said, how to be a father. 45 years they were married, a Hollywood marriage that simply did not break. He was asked once if they had ever had a real fight, a knockdown argument in all those decades. He thought about it and said, no, never. She would just say, let's talk about it later, and take a little walk. That was the whole secret. And one of those twin daughters, Kelly, grew up to go halfway around the world to the mountains of Rwanda to study and protect the wild gorillas there, and her father, the old general, would proudly tell the late-night audiences how things were going with the gorillas, like any beaming dad bragging about his girl. In 1994, Gloria died, and after she was gone, the light in Jimmy Stewart seemed to dim. He retreated into a long, quiet sunset, out of the public eye, in the home they had shared. He had spent his whole life learning that no matter how high a man rises, the thing that matters most is having a home to come back to.
When his home was gone, he was, in the truest sense, ready to follow her.
Jimmy Stewart died on the 2nd of July, 1997, at his home in Beverly Hills, with his children around him. He was 89 years old. His last words to his family were that he was going to be with Gloria now. The President of the United States said that America had lost a national treasure, a great actor, a gentleman, and a patriot. More than 3,000 people came to say goodbye. And because Brigadier General James Stewart had earned it the hard way, over the skies of Germany and across a lifetime of service, he was laid to rest with full military honors. Think about everything he could have been and chose not to be. He could have let Hollywood define him, could have been only a face on a poster, only an Oscar on a shelf. He had every chance to take the easy, comfortable, famous road and never once look back. He refused it. He was rejected by the army and made them take him anyway. He gave up the top of his career to go and fight, and asked for nothing when he came home. He climbed back into a bomber at 58, rather than send a young man somewhere he wouldn't go himself. And he loved one woman and one family and one small idea of home, all the way to the end. Because the greatest title a man can ever hold is not Oscar winner. It is not Brigadier General. It is the plainest one there is. An honest man. Jimmy Stewart's whole life is a quiet reminder of something we are in danger of forgetting. That no matter how high we climb, we must never lose the way back home. That decency is not weakness. That the loudest man in the room is rarely the best one in it. If this story meant something to you today, do me a favor. Pass it on. Share it with a veteran, with your father, with anyone in your life who still remembers what real character looks like. And hit that subscribe button if you haven't yet. There are more of these stories coming, about the men and women who built a better country and never asked for the credit. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next chapter.